The storm that night descended like nature's fury, engulfing everything in its path along the winding road to Pine Valley, a small town Ethan Carter never imagined he would set foot in. The rain pounded mercilessly against his car windshield, while fierce winds howled through the darkness, threatening to tear apart anything in their way. His luxury car skidded on the wet pavement before violently crashing into a roadside tree. The dashboard clock blinked silently, marking each passing second as the bitter cold seeped through his expensive coat. Pain shot through his arm, and warm blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. As his consciousness began to fade, he caught a glimpse of a blurry figure running toward him through the rain. A gentle voice pierced through the chaos. "Hold on, you're going to be okay. I'm here." When Ethan regained consciousness, he found himself lying in a modest room, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. He felt warm hands tending to his wounds, and his gaze settled on her, a woman with striking hazel eyes that held both kindness and an untold sadness. She was Sophia Lane, a volunteer nurse at this humble medical station. Time seemed to slow down in the small town of Pine Valley. Outside the window, rain continued to fall steadily, but inside the tiny treatment room, something inexplicable was beginning to grow between Sophia and Ethan. A connection that words couldn't define. Ethan Carter blinked a few times, his vision still blurry as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and a single lamp casting a warm glow. The sound of rain tapping against the window filled the silence. He shifted slightly, wincing as pain shot through his arm. "Careful," a soft voice said. He turned his head and saw her, Sophia Lane. She was sitting beside him, carefully wrapping a bandage around his arm. Her hazel eyes met his, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. "Where am I?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "You're in Pine Valley," Sophia replied, her tone calm and reassuring. "You had an accident. Your car skidded off the road during the storm. I found you and brought you here." Ethan tried to sit up, but Sophia gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You need to rest. You were lucky. It could have been much worse." He studied her face, noticing the faint lines of exhaustion and the quiet strength in her expression. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Sophia gave him a small smile, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It's what I do," she said simply, "helping people." Over the next few days, Ethan remained in Pine Valley to recover. Sophia visited him regularly, checking his wounds and ensuring he was comfortable. Despite her quiet demeanor, there was something about her that intrigued him. She wasn't like anyone he had met before. Ethan was used to the fast-paced world of New York City, where he was a renowned architect known for designing skyscrapers and luxury buildings. His life was filled with deadlines, high-stakes meetings, and the constant pressure to succeed. But here, in this small town, everything felt different. Slower. Simpler. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at home in Pine Valley. She worked at the local clinic, treating patients who couldn't afford proper medical care. Her days were long and often thankless, but she carried herself with a quiet grace that Ethan couldn't help but admire. One evening, as the rain continued to fall outside, Sophia brought him a bowl of soup. "You should eat," she said, placing it on the small table beside his bed. Ethan chuckled softly. "You're starting to sound like my mother." Sophia raised an eyebrow, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Well, someone has to make sure you take care of yourself." As they talked, Ethan found himself opening up in a way he hadn't in years. He told her about his career, the long hours, and the sacrifices he had made to reach the top. "Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it," he admitted, staring at the rain-soaked window. "I've built so much, but it all feels empty." Sophia listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I used to think the same way," she said after a moment. "I thought success meant proving myself to the world, but then I realized that the only thing that really matters is doing what makes you happy." Ethan looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. "And does this make you happy? Living here, working at the clinic?" Sophia hesitated, her gaze distant. "It's not perfect," she admitted. "But here, I can help people without anyone expecting anything in return. No pressure, no judgment." Her words stayed with Ethan long after she left that night. He couldn't stop thinking about her kindness, her strength, and the quiet sadness that seemed to linger behind her smile. There was so much he didn't know about her, but he wanted to. The next day, Ethan insisted on getting out of bed. "I can't just lie here forever," he said, ignoring Sophia's protests. "I need to stretch my legs." Reluctantly, she agreed to take him for a walk around the clinic. As they strolled through the small garden behind the building, Ethan noticed how the townspeople greeted Sophia with warmth and gratitude. It was clear that she was deeply respected and loved in this community. "You're like a hero here," he said, watching as a young boy ran up to thank her for treating his injured dog. Sophia laughed softly. "Hardly. I'm just doing my job." But to Ethan, she was so much more than that. In just a few days, she had shown him a side of life he had almost forgotten, a life filled with genuine connections and simple joys. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Ethan turned to Sophia. "Thank you," he said again, his voice filled with sincerity, "not just for saving my life, but for reminding me what it means to really live." Sophia looked at him, her hazel eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan. Sometimes life has a way of showing us what we need, even when we don't realize it." For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of peace, and as he stood there beside Sophia, he couldn't help but wonder if meeting her was more than just a coincidence. The days in Pine Valley passed slowly, but for Ethan Carter, they felt like a welcome escape from the chaos of his usual life. Each morning, Sophia Lane would stop by the small room where he was staying, checking his wounds and making sure he was healing properly. Her presence had become a constant, and Ethan found himself looking forward to her visits more than he cared to admit. One evening, as the rain finally gave way to a clear sky, Sophia invited Ethan to join her for dinner in the clinic's small kitchen. "You've been cooped up in that room for too long," she said with a teasing smile. "It's time you had a proper meal." Ethan followed her, still favoring his injured arm, but feeling stronger with each passing day. The kitchen was modest, with mismatched chairs and a table that had clearly seen better days. But there was a warmth to it, a sense of home that Ethan hadn't felt in years. Sophia set a steaming bowl of stew in front of him and sat down across the table. "It's not fancy," she said, almost apologetically, "but it's the best I could do with what we have." Ethan took a bite and smiled. "It's perfect," he said, and he meant it. There was something about the simplicity of the moment, the two of them sitting together, sharing a meal, that felt more meaningful than any lavish dinner he'd ever attended in the city. As they ate, their conversation flowed easily. Ethan told Sophia about his childhood, growing up in a small town not unlike Pine Valley, and how he had always dreamed of building something bigger. "I wanted to create things that would last," he said, his voice tinged with pride and regret. "But somewhere along the way, I think I lost sight of why I started." Sophia listened intently, her hazel eyes never leaving his. "It's easy to get caught up in the expectations of others," she said softly. "But it's never too late to find your way back to what really matters." Ethan looked at her, struck by the quiet wisdom in her words. "And what about you?" he asked. "What brought you here to Pine Valley?" Sophia hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's a long story," she said finally. "Let's just say I needed a fresh start." Ethan didn't press her, sensing that there was more to her story than she was ready to share. But the mystery only made him more drawn to her. There was a strength in Sophia, a resilience that he couldn't help but admire. Over the next few days, their bond deepened. Ethan began to accompany Sophia on her rounds at the clinic, watching as she cared for her patients with a tenderness and dedication that left him in awe. She treated everyone the same, from the elderly man with a persistent cough to the young girl with a scraped knee. To her, every life mattered. One afternoon, as they walked back to the clinic after visiting a patient, Ethan turned to Sophia. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Sophia laughed, a light, musical sound that made Ethan's chest tighten. "I'm just doing my job," she said, brushing off the compliment. "No," Ethan said firmly. "It's more than that. You care about people in a way that most don't. You make them feel seen, valued. That's rare." Sophia's smile faltered for a moment, and Ethan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "Sometimes I think I care too much," she admitted. "It's not always easy, letting people in." Ethan nodded, understanding more than he let on. "Maybe," he said, "but it's what makes you who you are, and that's something worth holding on to." That evening, as they sat by the fireplace in the clinic's small common room, Ethan found himself opening up to Sophia in a way he hadn't with anyone else. He told her about the pressures of his career, the sacrifices he had made, and the emptiness he often felt despite his success. Sophia listened quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "You know," she said after a long pause, "sometimes the things we think we want aren't what we really need." Ethan looked at her, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. "And what do you think I need?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia met his gaze, her hazel eyes searching his. "Maybe," she said softly, "you just need to let yourself be happy." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room. Then, slowly, Ethan reached out and took Sophia's hand in his. She didn't pull away. In that quiet moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just gratitude or admiration. It was something deeper, something neither of them could put into words. But as they sat there, their hands intertwined, both Ethan and Sophia knew that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The days in Pine Valley had become a blur of quiet moments and unspoken feelings. Ethan Carter found himself lingering longer than he had planned, not because of his injuries, but because of her, Sophia Lane. She had become his anchor in a way he hadn't expected, and for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. But life, as it often does, had other plans. One crisp morning, Ethan woke up to find Sophia sitting by the window, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the rising sun. She was reading a letter, her expression unreadable. When she noticed him stirring, she quickly folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. "Good morning," she said, her voice light, but Ethan could sense something was off. "Morning," he replied, sitting up. "Everything okay?" Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "Just some clinic paperwork," she said, brushing it off. But Ethan wasn't convinced. There was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Later that day, as Ethan wandered through the small town, he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. Two locals were chatting outside the general store, their voices low but clear enough for him to catch. "Did you hear about the guy staying at the clinic? Apparently he's some big-shot architect from New York." "Yeah, Ethan Carter. I looked him up. He's engaged to that investor Victoria Hayes. You know, the one who's always in the tabloids." Ethan's stomach dropped. He hadn't thought about Victoria in days, and now the weight of his reality came crashing down on him. He was engaged. His life in New York, the one he had been so eager to escape, was still waiting for him. That evening, Ethan decided to tell Sophia the truth. He found her in the clinic's small garden, tending to a patch of wildflowers. She looked up as he approached, her hazel eyes soft but guarded. "Sophia," he began, his voice heavy with guilt. "There's something I need to tell you." She straightened, brushing dirt off her hands. "What is it?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I'm engaged to someone back in New York." For a moment, Sophia didn't say anything. Then she nodded, her expression unreadable. "I see. It's not what you think," Ethan said quickly. "Victoria and it's complicated. Our relationship has been more about appearances than anything else. I haven't even spoken to her since I got here." Sophia crossed her arms, her gaze steady. But you're still engaged. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. I didn't plan for any of this to happen, he said. Meeting you, feeling this way, it wasn't supposed to happen. But it did, and now I don't know what to do. Sophia looked away, her jaw tightening. Ethan, I can't be the reason you walk away from your life. I won't be. You're not just a reason, Ethan said, stepping closer. You're the only thing that's felt real to me in years. Sophia shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. This isn't fair, she said, her voice breaking. To me, to her, to anyone. You need to figure out what you want, Ethan, and until you do, I can't be a part of this. Before Ethan could respond, Sophia turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the garden. The next morning, Ethan woke up to find Sophia gone. Her room at the clinic was empty, and the locals he asked had no idea where she had gone. She had left without a word, taking only her belongings and the memories they had shared. Ethan felt a hollow ache in his chest as he stood in the empty room where she had once cared for him. He found himself replaying their conversations, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled, the warmth of her hand in his. And now she was gone. He stayed in Pine Valley for a few more days, hoping she might return, but she didn't. Eventually, he had no choice but to leave. As he drove back to New York, the city's towering skyscrapers felt cold and uninviting. His penthouse apartment, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. Victoria was waiting for him when he returned, her perfectly styled hair and designer dress a stark contrast to the simplicity of Sophia. Ethan, she said, her tone clipped, you've been gone for weeks. Do you have any idea how this looked? Ethan barely heard her. His mind was still in Pine Valley with Sophia. I need some time, he said, cutting her off. To think. Victoria frowned, clearly annoyed. Time for what? We have a wedding to plan, Ethan. You can't just disappear whenever you feel like it. But Ethan wasn't listening. He walked past her, shutting himself in his office. He stared out the window at the city below, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had everything he had ever wanted, wealth, success, status, but none of it mattered without her. Meanwhile, Sophia had started a new chapter of her life in a different town. She had taken a job at a small community clinic, throwing herself into her work to distract from the pain of leaving Ethan. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget him. And then, one day, she discovered she was pregnant. The news hit her like a tidal wave, bringing with it a mix of fear and hope. She knew the child was Ethan's, but she also knew she couldn't go back to him. He had a life in New York, a fiancé, a world that she didn't belong to. So she made a decision. She would raise the child on her own, giving them the love and stability she had always longed for. It wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to make it work. As the months passed, Sophia built a quiet life for herself and her unborn child, but deep down, she knew that the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you ran. The years that followed were a blur of change and quiet resilience for both Ethan and Sophia. In New York, Ethan Carter threw himself back into his work, designing some of the most ambitious architectural projects of his career. To the outside world, he was the picture of success, a man at the top of his game, engaged to one of the most influential women in the city. But inside, he was a shadow of the man he had been in Pine Valley. Victoria Hayes, his fiancée, grew increasingly frustrated with his emotional distance. "You're here, but you're not really here," she said one evening, her voice sharp as she sipped her wine. "What's going on with you, Ethan?" Ethan didn't answer. How could he explain that his heart was still in a small town, miles away, with a woman who had vanished from his life? He had tried to find Sophia, hiring private investigators and following every lead, but it was as if she had disappeared into thin air. The more he searched, the more he realized how much she had meant to him, and how much he had lost. Eventually, Victoria grew tired of waiting for Ethan to come back to her emotionally. Their engagement ended quietly with little fanfare. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for," she said as she walked out of his apartment for the last time. Ethan didn't stop her. He knew she was right. He was searching for something, or rather someone, and until he found her, nothing else would matter. Meanwhile, in a small town far from New York, Sophia Lane was building a life of her own. Her son, Lucas, was the center of her world. With his bright blue eyes and mischievous smile, he was a constant reminder of Ethan, though she never spoke his name aloud. Sophia had settled into a quiet routine, working at a community clinic and raising Lucas on her own. The townspeople adored her, often commenting on how strong and independent she was. But they didn't see the moments when she sat by the window late at night, staring out at the stars, and wondering if Ethan ever thought about her. Lucas was a curious and lively child, always asking questions about the world around him. "Mommy, why don't I have a daddy like the other kids?" he asked one day, his innocent eyes looking up at her. Sophia's heart ached at the question, but she forced a smile. "You have me," she said, brushing a strand of hair from his face, "and that's all you need." But as Lucas grew older, Sophia knew the questions would only get harder to answer. She had made the choice to keep Ethan out of their lives, believing it was for the best. Yet, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right decision. Ethan, on the other hand, had never stopped searching. Every time he visited a new town for work or leisure, he found himself scanning the faces in the crowd, hoping to see her. He kept a photo of her in his wallet, a candid shot he had taken one evening in Pine Valley when she wasn't looking. It was the only tangible piece of her he had left. 5 years passed, and though the pain of losing Sophia had dulled, it never truly went away. Ethan had built a life that looked perfect on the surface, but it was hollow without her. He often wondered if she had moved on, if she was happy, if she ever thought about him. Then, one day, fate intervened. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Ethan found himself at a charity event in a small town just outside the city. The event was hosted by a local clinic, and Ethan had been invited as a guest speaker to discuss a new community center his firm was designing. He wasn't particularly excited about the event, but something about the invitation had caught his attention. The clinic's name, Starlight Community Health, sounded familiar, though he couldn't place why. As he walked through the event, shaking hands and making polite conversation, his eyes scanned the crowd out of habit, and then he saw her, Sophia. She was standing near a booth talking to a group of volunteers. Her hair was a little shorter, and there were faint lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But it was her. Ethan's heart stopped as he took in the sight of her, alive and real after all these years. For a moment he couldn't move. He was afraid that if he approached her, she might disappear again, like a dream slipping through his fingers. But then, as if sensing his gaze, Sophia turned. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to fall away. Sophia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't seen Ethan in 5 years, but there he was, standing just a few feet away, looking at her with the same intensity she remembered. Her heart raced as 1,000 emotions flooded her at once: shock, fear, longing. Before she could say anything, a small voice broke the silence. "Mommy, who's that?" Sophia looked down to see Lucas tugging at her hand, his bright blue eyes wide with curiosity. Ethan's gaze shifted to the boy, and in that instant, he knew. The resemblance was undeniable. Lucas had his eyes, his smile. He was Ethan's son. Ethan's breath caught as the realization hit him. "Sophia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, unable to speak. The moment she had dreaded for years was finally here, and there was no turning back. Ethan Carter stood frozen, his eyes locked on the boy who had just called Sophia Mommy. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what he was seeing. The boy, Lucas, looked up at him with a curious expression, his bright blue eyes a mirror of Ethan's own. There was no denying it. This was his son. Sophia knelt down beside Lucas, her hands trembling as she smoothed his hair. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice shaking, "why don't you go play with the other kids for a little while? I'll be right here." Lucas hesitated, glancing between his mother and the stranger who was staring at him with an intensity he didn't understand. But eventually he nodded and ran off toward a group of children playing nearby. As soon as Lucas was out of earshot, Ethan turned to Sophia, his voice low but filled with emotion. "He's mine, isn't he?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes," she whispered. "He's your son." Ethan took a step closer, his hands clenching at his sides as a wave of emotions crashed over him: shock, anger, joy, and an overwhelming sense of loss. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you keep him from me?" Sophia looked up at him, her hazel eyes filled with guilt and pain. "I didn't know how," she said. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. You had a life in New York, a fiancé. I didn't want to complicate things for you." "Complicate things?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "Sophia, he's my son. I had a right to know." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I should have told you, but I was scared. I didn't think you'd want this life, Ethan. I didn't think you'd want us." Ethan's chest tightened as he heard the pain in her voice. He wanted to be angry, to demand answers, but all he could feel was the weight of the years they had lost. "You don't get to decide that for me," he said quietly. "You don't get to take away my chance to be his father." Sophia wiped her tears, her hands trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said. "I thought I was protecting him, and maybe I was protecting myself too." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Sophia," he said, his voice softer now, "I've spent the last 5 years searching for you. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you. And now to find out that I have a son, I don't even know where to start." Sophia looked at him, her heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to face you after everything." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then Ethan spoke, his voice firm but filled with determination. "I want to know him," he said. "I want to be a part of his life. I've already missed so much, and I can't lose any more time." Sophia hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent years building a life for herself and Lucas, keeping Ethan at a distance to protect them both. But now, standing in front of him, she realized that she couldn't keep running from the past. Lucas deserved to know his father, and Ethan deserved a chance to be in his son's life. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't going to be easy, Ethan. Lucas doesn't know anything about you. He's going to have questions, and I don't know how he'll react." Ethan nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll take it one step at a time," he said. "I just need a chance, Sophia. That's all I'm asking for." Sophia looked at him, her heart torn between fear and hope. She had spent so long trying to protect herself and Lucas from the pain of the past. But now, she realized that maybe it was time to let Ethan in. Maybe it was time to stop running. "Okay," she said again, her voice steadier this time. "We'll figure this out. Together." Ethan's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in years he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Sophia or Lucas slip away again. As they stood there, the autumn leaves swirling around them, it felt like the beginning of something new, something fragile, but full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, both Ethan and Sophia allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for both Ethan and Sophia. For Ethan, the joy of discovering his son was tempered by the realization of how much he had missed. Lucas was 5 years old. 5 years of first words, first steps, and countless moments that Ethan would never get back. But he was determined to make up for lost time, no matter how difficult it might be. For Sophia, the decision to let Ethan into their lives was both terrifying and liberating. She had spent years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she and Lucas were better off without Ethan. But now, seeing the way Ethan looked at Lucas, with a mixture of awe, love, and regret, she knew she couldn't keep them apart any longer. The first meeting between Ethan and Lucas was awkward but heartwarming. Sophia had explained to Lucas that Ethan was someone very special, someone who had been away for a long time but wanted to get to know him. Lucas, ever curious and full of energy, had simply asked, "Are you my dad?" Ethan had knelt down, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Lucas," he said. "I'm your dad, and I'm so happy to finally meet you." Lucas had studied him for a moment, his bright blue eyes narrowing in thought. Then, with the blunt honesty only a child could manage, he said, "You're really tall." The tension broke, and Ethan laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that he hadn't felt in years. "I guess I am," he said, ruffling Lucas's hair, "but I bet you'll be just as tall one day." From that moment on, Lucas seemed to accept Ethan with the easy trust of a child. He asked endless questions about Ethan's life, his work, and even his favorite ice cream flavor. Ethan answered every question with patience and enthusiasm, marveling at how much Lucas reminded him of himself at that age. But while Lucas adjusted quickly to having Ethan around, things were more complicated between Ethan and Sophia. There were still so many unresolved feelings between them, so many things left unsaid. One evening, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan and Sophia found themselves alone in the small living room of her house. "Thank you," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "for letting me be a part of his life. I know it wasn't an easy decision." Sophia nodded, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "He deserves to know you," she said, "and you deserve to know him. I didn't know how to face you after everything." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Sophia, I'm not angry," he said. "I was at first, but now I just want to understand. Why did you leave without saying anything? Why didn't you tell me about Lucas?" Sophia sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "When I found out who you really were, your life, your fiancé, I felt like I didn't belong in your world. And when I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would be easier for everyone if I just disappeared." "Easier for who?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but firm. "Because it wasn't easier for me, Sophia. I've spent the last 5 years searching for you, wondering what I did wrong, why you left." Sophia looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said. "I didn't want to be the reason your life fell apart. And I didn't want Lucas to grow up feeling like he wasn't enough." Ethan shook his head, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. "You were never not enough, Sophia," he said. "You and Lucas are the only things that have ever felt real to me. Everything else, New York, my career, even my engagement, it all feels so empty without you." Sophia's breath caught at his words, and for a moment she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. But the fear was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. "Ethan," she said quietly, "this isn't going to be easy. We're not the same people we were 5 years ago." "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But I'm willing to fight for this, for you, for Lucas, for us. I don't care how hard it is. I just want a chance." Sophia looked at him, her heart torn between hope and doubt. She had spent so long running from the past, but now, with Ethan sitting in front of her, she realized that maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to face the pain, the fear, and the uncertainty, and to take a chance on the future. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll try. But we take it one step at a time." Ethan nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension. "One step at a time," he agreed. And for the first time in years, they both felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile but undeniable belief that they could rebuild what had been lost. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rebuilding trust and forging new bonds. Ethan Carter stayed in the small town, renting a modest house just a few streets away from Sophia and Lucas. It was a far cry from his sleek New York penthouse, but for the first time in years, he felt at home. Ethan spent every moment he could with Lucas, learning everything about his son. The way he loved to draw, his fascination with airplanes, and his habit of asking a million questions before bedtime. Lucas, in turn, adored Ethan, often dragging him outside to play catch or showing him his latest crayon masterpiece. The bond between them grew quickly, and Sophia couldn't help but smile as she watched them together. For all her fears, it was clear that Lucas had found a father who loved him deeply. But while things were falling into place for Lucas and Ethan, the relationship between Ethan and Sophia was more complicated. There were moments of warmth and connection, shared laughter over Lucas's antics, quiet conversations late at night. But there were also moments of hesitation, of unspoken fears and lingering doubts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan and Sophia found themselves sitting on her porch. Lucas had fallen asleep after an exhausting day of playing at the park, and the house was quiet. "You've done an amazing job with him," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "He's smart, kind, and so full of life. That's all because of you." Sophia smiled softly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "He's a good kid," she said, "but he's a lot like you know, stubborn, curious, always asking questions." Ethan chuckled, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I see it too," he said, "and I can't thank you enough for raising him, for giving him such a good life. But I want to be here now, Sophia. I want to be part of his life, and yours." Sophia's smile faltered, and she looked down at her mug. "Ethan, I'm scared," she admitted. "I've spent so long protecting Lucas, protecting myself. Letting you in, it's not easy for me." "I know," Ethan said, his voice gentle, "and I don't expect it to be. But I'm not going anywhere, Sophia. I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm not the man I was 5 years ago." Sophia looked at him, her hazel eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "I want to believe that," she said. "I really do. But this isn't just about us anymore. It's about Lucas. I can't let him get hurt." Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. "I would never hurt him," he said firmly. "Or you. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm here now, and I'm not going to let either of you go again." For a moment, Sophia didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll take it one day at a time." Months passed, and the three of them began to settle into a new rhythm. Ethan became a fixture in Lucas's life, attending school events, helping with homework, and even learning how to bake cookies, though his first attempt was a disaster. The townspeople, who had been wary of him at first, began to warm up to him as they saw how devoted he was to Sophia and Lucas. One crisp spring morning, Ethan surprised Sophia by taking her and Lucas to a nearby field filled with wild flowers. As Lucas ran ahead, chasing butterflies, Ethan turned to Sophia, his expression serious. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said, "about everything we've been through and everything we've built together these past few months." Sophia's heart raced as she looked at him. "Ethan." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I know we've had our share of challenges," he said, his voice steady. "But I also know that I love you, Sophia. I've loved you since the moment you saved my life in Pine Valley, and I've never stopped. I want to spend the rest of my life with you and Lucas. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Sophia's eyes as she looked at the man who had fought so hard to be a part of her life. She thought about the years of pain and fear, the walls she had built around her heart, and how Ethan had slowly but surely broken through them. And then she thought about Lucas, who had found a father who loved him unconditionally. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ethan's face broke into a wide smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Lucas, noticing the commotion, ran over and asked, "What's going on?" Ethan scooped him up, laughing. "Your mom just said yes to being my wife. What do you think about that?" Lucas grinned. "Does that mean we get to eat cake?" Sophia and Ethan burst into laughter, and in that moment everything felt right. They had faced their past, overcome their fears, and found their way back to each other. Together they were a family, a little unconventional, but full of love. As the three of them stood in the field, surrounded by wildflowers and sunlight, it was clear that this was only the beginning of their happily ever after. Thank you so much for watching this story on Emma's Stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and inspiring tales. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more amazing stories with you. See you in the next one.